The aliens stood tall, their eyes gleaming with condescension as they watched the lone human step forward. Their laughter, an eerie mixture of guttural growls and high-pitched chittering, echoed across the grand chamber. "You bring a human to speak on your behalf?" One of the Eldari warlords scoffed, his golden exoskeleton glinting under the artificial lights. "This is an insult to the Dominion. Humans are barely more than animals." The Galactic Dominion had ruled for thousands of years, crushing civilizations that dared to resist, absorbing cultures only to erase them, rewriting history until nothing remained of those they conquered. And now humanity was next. Earth had barely begun to reach beyond its solar system when the Dominion arrived, demanding surrender or annihilation. The other council members, beings from 100 different species, watched with amusement. They had seen this before: defiance, arrogance, and then complete subjugation. The Eldari, the ruling race of the Dominion, took pleasure in breaking species that thought they could stand against them. The human ambassador, Dr. Elias Carter, stood alone. No weapons, no armor, no army, just a simple man in a worn-out suit. His presence was a joke to them, a final act of desperation from an already defeated species. Carter cleared his throat. His hands didn't shake. His voice was calm. "I will speak," he said, his words precise, "but not in your tongue." More laughter. Some of the Eldari banged their fists against the stone tables, a mocking display of their superiority. "And what language will you use, ape?" Warlord Zelvaran sneered. "Your own? A primitive dialect from an insignificant rock?" Carter's lips curled into a small smile. "Number I will speak in yours, but not the one you know." The laughter faded, confusion settling in the room. And then he spoke. The moment the first syllable left his mouth, the chamber fell silent. The air grew heavy, as if the very walls could feel the weight of the words. The Eldari warlords, once so smug and composed, recoiled as if struck. Their eyes widened, mandibles clicking in shock. Carter continued, his voice echoing like a ghost from another time. The sounds were harsh, guttural, yet fluid, carrying the weight of something ancient, something lost. The Eldari trembled. One of them dropped to a knee, his exoskeleton trembling violently. Another clutched his head, as if trying to block out the sound. Zelvoran stumbled back, his golden eyes burning with something that had not been seen in the Dominion for thousands of years. Fear. "Stop," he choked out. "Where did you learn this?" Carter did not stop. The words poured out of him like a river breaking free from a dam. The language was dead, wiped from history by the Eldari themselves. It was the tongue of their ancestors, the language of the first Eldari Empire, long before the Dominion. A language they had buried because it spoke of things they feared, of power they had forsaken, of a time when they were not gods, but mortals, fragile and fallible. "It is impossible," another Eldari rasped. "No outsider can know this." Carter took a step forward. The warlords flinched. "Your people tried to erase this language from existence," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the forgotten past. "But you failed, because history has a way of surviving, in the most unexpected places." The council chamber, once filled with arrogance and laughter, was now a tomb of silence. The Dominion was built on the belief that they were untouchable, that they had conquered all that was before them. But now, standing before them, was a simple human who spoke the language of their ancestors, a language they themselves no longer understood. Carter let the last word hang in the air. The warlords did not speak. They could not. They only stared at him, at this human who had become the voice of something ancient, something powerful, something they thought was lost forever. Then, softly, Carter spoke again, this time in their modern tongue. Kneel. And for the first time in thousands of years, the Eldari did. The silence in the chamber stretched on, thick and suffocating. The warlords of the Eldari, once the undisputed rulers of the Dominion, stood frozen, caught between the weight of their ancestors' lost tongue and the impossible truth that a mere human had spoken it. Dr. Elias Carter let them simmer in their confusion. He had studied them for years, not just their technology, not just their empire, but their very foundation. He had read the forbidden texts, dug into the ruins they thought were hidden from the rest of the galaxy. And in those ruins, he had found their greatest shame. Zelvaran was the first to break the silence. His golden exoskeleton quivered with something his kind had long forgotten: uncertainty. "Where did you learn this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter tilted his head. "The question you should be asking is, why did you forget it?" Another murmur ran through the council. The Eldari were an old race, older than most species in the Dominion. They prided themselves on their long and unbroken history. But it wasn't unbroken, was it? They had erased something they had been too afraid to remember. "No one speaks the old tongue," one of the other warlords rasped, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Not even us. It was purged, locked away, forbidden." Carter took another step forward, and this time, no one moved to stop him. "And yet here I am," he said, "speaking it." The power dynamic in the room had shifted. The laughter, the mockery, the sheer arrogance that had filled the chamber moments ago had evaporated. The mighty Eldari, conquerors of 1,000 worlds, looked at him with something that went beyond fear. It was recognition. Carter pressed his advantage. "You see, the thing about history is that it doesn't stay buried forever," he continued, pacing slowly. "You can erase records, burn books, rewrite laws, but you can't erase memory. The truth has a way of surviving, whether you want it to or not." Zelvaran's fists clenched. "You are a fool if you think mere words will undo the Dominion." Carter smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Words have undone greater empires than yours." The Eldari warlord moved to speak again, but Carter cut him off. This time he spoke louder, his voice ringing with authority. He didn't just recite the old tongue, he commanded it. And the chamber shook. The towering stone pillars trembled. The air itself seemed to ripple, charged with something unseen but deeply felt. The alien council members recoiled, eyes wide in disbelief. The Dominion's rulers had buried the old tongue for a reason. It wasn't just a language. It was power. It carried the weight of something ancient, something real. Zelvaran stumbled back, gripping the edges of his throne. His once perfect control had cracked, revealing the raw, primal fear beneath. "Impossible," he whispered. "It was lost. It was dead." Carter took one final step, now standing before the warlords like an executioner before the condemned. "And yet here it is," he said softly. "Here I am." The Eldari were proud, ruthless, and unforgiving. But they were not stupid. They understood what was happening. The moment their own kind saw this, saw a human wielding what they had long abandoned, their rule would fracture. The Dominion would never be the same. Carter folded his hands behind his back. "So now, we negotiate." Zelvaran's mandibles clicked, his breath coming sharp and fast. "And if we refuse?" Carter simply smiled. "Then I keep talking." The warlords, who had once laughed at humanity, now sat in fearful silence. The Dominion had believed themselves untouchable. But they had forgotten something buried in their own past. Words were power. And humans had just learned to speak the deadliest one of all. The silence in the chamber stretched, thick with the weight of history resurfacing. The mighty warlords of the Eldery Dominion, once gods among lesser beings, now looked like frightened children facing the shadows of their ancestors. Dr. Elias Carter stood in the center of it all, calm, unwavering. He could feel the tension in the air, the realization creeping into the warlords' minds like a slow poison. They had spent centuries erasing this language, silencing its echoes, and now here was a human, one of the very species they had mocked, resurrecting it. Zelvaran's breathing had grown uneven, his golden exoskeleton reflecting the dim light like a relic of a forgotten age. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow. "What do you want?" Carter let the words hang for a moment. He had expected the resistance to last longer, but fear was a powerful tool, one the Eldari had used for millennia. Now it was being used against them. "Humanity's sovereignty," Carter said, his voice even. "Earth and all its colonies will remain independent. No dominion rule, no forced integration, no tribute." The warlords stirred, some bristling, others hesitating. One of them, a towering Eldari with obsidian plating, let out a dry, humorless hiss. "You ask too much." Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Do I?" He took a slow step forward, and the warlords unconsciously leaned back. "Because from where I stand, I think I'm being generous." Zelvaran's mandibles twitched, his mind working through the impossible situation. "You think, because you speak an old language, that you have power over us?" Carter tilted his head. "Number, I know I do." He let his next words slip from his tongue in the old tongue once more, rolling them like thunder across the chamber. The effect was immediate. The walls trembled again, as if the very structure of the Dominion itself resented the language being spoken aloud. But it wasn't the walls Carter was watching. It was the warlords. Their bodies twitched, their minds battling instincts they didn't even understand. Their pupils dilated, their breathing hitched, and their hands clenched at nothing. Because they remembered. Not consciously. No, that knowledge had been buried too deep, too long ago, but something within them, the blood of their ancestors, the echoes of an empire older than even the Dominion, recognized the words. This was the language of their creators. The Eldari had ruled for thousands of years, but they had not always ruled. There was a time before their empire, before their dominion over the galaxy. They had been slaves once, servants to beings who spoke this tongue. And those beings had vanished. The Eldari had destroyed all traces of them, purging history, rewriting their own origins to hide the truth. That once, long ago, they had been beneath someone else. And now, here was a human, speaking the words of their long-forgotten masters. Carter watched the realization settle in, saw the fear crystallize into something colder. "You remember, don't you?" he said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. "Even if you don't know why." Zelvaran swallowed, something Carter had never seen an Eldari do before. "You cannot use what you do not understand." Carter only smiled. "Can't I?" He took another step, and the Eldari didn't move. "You fear this language because you buried it, but we have dug it up. We know things now, things you tried to erase." He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "And if humanity knows, how long before the rest of the galaxy does, too?" The warlords stiffened. The Dominion was built on an unshakable foundation, on the belief that the Eldari were the highest, the most powerful, the eternal rulers of the stars. But if the truth came out, if their subjects learned that the Eldari had once bowed to another, the Dominion would not survive it. Zelvaran's breath was ragged now, his mind torn between pride and survival. The other warlords were silent, their gazes darting between Carter and their leader, waiting. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, Zelvaran exhaled. And then he bowed his head. The Dominion recognizes the sovereignty of humanity. Carter nodded, satisfied. Good choice. The warlords of the Eldari Dominion, once so mighty, so untouchable, sat in silence as a human turned and walked away, leaving them with the weight of a history they could no longer escape. And across the stars, a shift began. For the first time in thousands of years, the Dominion had knelt. And it would not be the last. The Dominion's concession had shaken the galaxy, but Carter knew better than to believe the war was over. Fear had forced the Eldari to bow, but fear was a temporary leash. The moment they found a way to cut it, they would come for humanity with a vengeance. That meant humanity had little time. Back on Earth, the leaders of the newly secured Human Federation were celebrating their victory, praising Carter as the man who had done the impossible. But Carter didn't stay for the parades, the interviews, or the political maneuvering. Instead, he boarded a ship bound for the edges of known space. Because while Earth celebrated, he had one burning question that refused to leave his mind. What were the Eldari so desperate to erase? The Peregrine was a small, unremarkable ship, perfect for slipping past Dominion patrols. On board, Carter had assembled a team, not politicians, not generals, but scholars, historians, and archaeologists, the best minds humanity had to offer. Their destination, a dead world, one that didn't appear on any Dominion star charts, a world Carter had only learned about by deciphering forbidden texts, tracking inconsistencies in ancient records, and finding echoes of something older than the Dominion itself, a world called Voral-Ka. The planet was a wasteland. As the Peregrine descended through the storm-choked atmosphere, Carter could already tell that whatever had happened here, it had been deliberate. Massive glassed craters stretched across the land, entire cities reduced to nothing but skeletal remains of towers half swallowed by time. This wasn't just an abandoned world. It was a purged one. Something doesn't add up, Vasquez murmured beside him as they stepped onto the cracked surface. The rest of the team fanned out, scanning ruins, gathering data. Carter knelt, running his fingers over a broken slab of stone. The inscriptions were barely legible, but he recognized the script immediately. The old tongue. The Dominion had erased this place from history, wiped it from maps, buried it under layers of propaganda. And now he knew why, because this had been their beginning. Not as rulers, as slaves. Hours later, deep within the ruins, Carter and his team found what they had been looking for. A massive chamber, sealed beneath the earth. Carvings covered the walls, depicting creatures that bore a vague resemblance to the Eldari, but taller, more imposing. Their features were crueler, their posture rigid, exuding authority. The Eldari hadn't always been the ones in charge. They had served something else, something that had disappeared. Carter swallowed hard. He traced a carving with his fingers, feeling the rough edges of the stone. The story it told was unmistakable. The Eldari had rebelled. They had overthrown their masters, and then they had wiped them out. Every record, every trace, every whisper of the beings that had once ruled them. Vasquez stepped beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they're still out there?" Carter exhaled slowly. If they were powerful enough to rule the Eldari, we better hope they're not. But deep in his gut, he had a sinking feeling. Something that had once ruled a species as ruthless as the Eldari would not have simply vanished. And if they were still out there, then humanity had just done something very, very dangerous. They had spoken their language, and something, somewhere, might have heard. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Carter like a vice. The Eldari had not been the first rulers of the stars. They had been subjects, servants to something older, something powerful enough to command them before they had risen in rebellion and erased all traces of their former masters. And now, humanity had spoken that forbidden tongue. If the Eldari had feared it, if they had erased history so thoroughly to hide the truth, then what were they really afraid of? That someone would uncover the past? Or that the past would hear them? Carter exhaled, his breath fogging in the damp underground chamber. His fingers ran over the ancient inscriptions one more time, tracing the outlines of the towering figures carved into the stone. The worn edges of their faces still radiated something cold, something watchful. Vasquez stood beside him, her posture rigid. "We should leave." Carter turned his head slightly. Scared? Her jaw tightened. Cautious. She wasn't wrong. The Peregrine was alone out here, deep in uncharted space. If anything happened, no one was coming to save them. Carter was about to respond when one of the archaeologists called out from deeper within the ruins. "Doctor! Carter! You need to see this!" He exchanged a glance with Vasquez before following the voice. They moved through the darkened corridors of the chamber, flashlights cutting through dust and time. The deeper they went, the stronger the air seemed to press against them, thick with the weight of something waiting. At the far end of the chamber, a massive stone door stood ajar, dust swirling in the air beyond it. The archaeologist, a young woman named Malik, was standing at its entrance, her face pale. "It's not just a tomb," she whispered. "It's a warning." Carter stepped inside, and the moment he saw what was waiting, his breath caught in his throat. The walls here were not carved with images of rulers or battles. They were filled with something else. Writing. Hundreds of lines, all in the same forbidden language. And unlike the rest of the ruins, these words were not worn by time. They were pristine, untouched, as if the universe itself refused to let them fade. Carter stepped closer, reading aloud the first inscription. "They will return." Vasquez stiffened. "That's not good." Carter continued. "They watch the stars. They wait for the tongue to be spoken again." A chill ran down his spine. The Eldari hadn't just erased their masters out of shame. They had erased them out of fear, because whatever had ruled them before had not been destroyed. Only sleeping. Vasquez took an uneasy step back. "We need to get off this planet, now." Carter's heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm. He looked at the last inscription, the one at the center of the wall, written in larger script than all the others. He read it aloud. "The first kings of the stars will rise again." A deep, distant rumble vibrated through the chamber. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Somewhere far beneath them, something groaned. Something woke up. Carter turned to Vasquez, his voice tight. "Run!" The deep rumble beneath the ruins grew into a low, vibrating thrum that Carter could feel in his bones. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the once-dead chamber felt suddenly alive. Malik was already backing away, her eyes wide with terror. "That wasn't a tremor, was it?" "No," Carter muttered, pulse hammering. "Something's moving." Vasquez grabbed his arm. "We need to go, now." But Carter's eyes were still locked on the ancient inscriptions. The words had burned themselves into his mind. "The first kings of the stars will rise again." The Dominion had wiped them from history, erased every trace of their rule. But now Carter knew the truth. The first kings had never been defeated. The Eldari hadn't won. They had only survived. The thrum beneath their feet grew louder, deeper, like an impossibly large engine roaring to life. The entire ruin shifted, and from deep within the stone walls, a noise echoed through the corridors. Something between a mechanical hum and a deep, resonant heartbeat. Something was waking up. "Move!" Vasquez shouted, grabbing Carter's shoulder and yanking him toward the exit. The team bolted through the tunnels, their boots slamming against stone floors, their flashlights casting frantic shadows. The air felt charged, as if electricity was dancing through the ruins, stirring the dust of a long, dead civilization back into motion. And then, a sound. Not the rumble beneath their feet, not the collapsing stone, a voice, a deep, resonant whisper, so low it seemed to crawl inside their skulls rather than pass through their ears. "Who speaks our tongue?" Carter nearly stumbled. His breath caught in his throat. The others didn't seem to hear it, not the same way he did. But something in the chamber had heard him speak. And now it was speaking back. "Fleshborn, carbon-made, you are not our kin." It wasn't just sound, it was understanding. The words didn't come from the walls, or from an entity standing before him. They came from everywhere, from the ruins themselves, from something buried deep. The moment they reached the outer chamber, Malik gasped. "Oh my God!" Carter turned, his heart slamming against his ribs. The ancient carvings, once faded, broken, nearly erased, were glowing. Lines of energy, dull gold in color, flickered across the walls. The inscriptions in the old tongue shifted, rearranging themselves as if responding to his presence. The voice came again, this time louder. "You have spoken the words of the forgotten. The silence is broken." Carter could barely breathe. The chamber itself seemed to hum, the walls pulsing like the veins of something colossal, something awakening. "You are not the Eldari. You are new, small. You do not belong." The others were shouting now, trying to pull Carter toward the exit, but he was frozen, unable to look away from the shifting inscriptions. Then, the final words came, low and cold, crawling into his skull like fingers made of shadow. "We are coming." The ruins exploded into chaos. Stone cracked, walls split open. From beneath the surface, enormous black structures, machines unlike anything humanity had ever seen, began rising. And Carter realized with absolute horror that they hadn't just discovered a lost civilization. They had triggered its return. Vasquez grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the ship. "Carter, move!" He stumbled forward, his mind racing. The First Kings weren't a myth. They weren't extinct. They had been asleep. And humanity had just woken them up. The Peregrine's engines roared to life as Carter and his team sprinted aboard, breathless, hearts pounding. The ground beneath them trembled, not with aftershocks, but with the pulse of something vast, something waking. "Get us out of here!" Vasquez shouted to the pilot. Through the viewport, the ruins of Voral-Ka were changing. The ancient stone gave way to rising structures, black monoliths twisting into the sky like skeletal fingers clawing their way out of a grave. Energy crackled along their surfaces, dull gold lines illuminating the world in a dead light. As the Peregrine lifted off, Carter saw it, the first shape emerging from the depths. It was impossible to grasp its true form, its edges blurred by something his mind couldn't fully comprehend. But its eyes, twin pools of glowing darkness, locked onto him. And then the voice returned. "Your kind has spoken. Your kind has heard. Now, your kind will kneel." The Peregrine shot into the sky, leaving the planet behind. But Carter knew distance wouldn't save them. The First Kings were awake, and they were coming.